All right, friends, welcome back. We're continuing our series on apologetics, and what we're looking at is this idea of blind faith. Is Christianity just this sort of irrational system that we've come up with to feel good about ourselves and to avoid any real engagement with the truth? Ultimately, does Christianity require a suspension of our reason or thinking? Perhaps you've heard this, I only believe in what I can see or I can prove. And what's happening on the cultural level is Christianity and its claims are actually not being engaged with. Rather, it's being put to the side by being mocked as this sort of shallow, unintelligent system of thought. So rather than our claims really being engaged with, what you're seeing is you're being marginalized by your faith, because it's being portrayed in this caricature as Christians are just kind of dumb, anti-intellectual. And so what I hope to do with this series is to encourage you and to know that your faith is not actually a suspension of reason. And that's what we started last week. Last week we were looking at the unseen in faith, just kind of a review. And what scriptures are talking about when they refer to faith as trusting in something unseen is not because it's unreasonable. What they mean is it hasn't come to pass yet. In other words, it's not that it's irrational. Rather, one has faith in the promises of God. We trust Him. In other words, it is reasonable to bank on Him. And what is unseen in that faith is that His promises have yet to be fulfilled to His people. That's where Scripture is going in terms of the unseen of faith. It is not saying suspend reason. It is ultimately putting before us and saying, well, what is most reliable? What can you bank on most? And rather than trusting in man, Scripture puts before us that God's promises are more reliable than man's. So you can trust God to bring about what He says He will do. That's what we mean by having faith in Him. So, number one, faith is not the suspension of reason. And one of the counterpoints I made last week is that everyone actually has blind faith, or what we might call pre-scientific beliefs. That is, no one only believes in science or evidence. Everyone has to accept certain truths about the universe before you can even be able to use science. So the criticism that Christianity doesn't rely upon science as its basis is actually inconsistent, because anyone who asserts that they only believe in science do so by a pre- or non-scientific basis. It's inconsistent on their part to make such claims. And I gave you a few examples. Science requires the laws of logic. And that's not something science can prove. It must be true in order to use science. Science requires uniformity. That is, that the future will be like the past. On what basis can you perform an experiment over and over again? Well, if you assume the universe is uniform, then you can trust in your outcome. But if you don't assume it, well, then you can't trust it. So science requires uniformity. History. There's no way of us going back in time and proving the earth wasn't created 5 minutes ago. We, by faith, trust in it as real and compare past scientific results with future ones. Fourth, other minds. Yes, we engage with other consciousnesses in our experience, but we actually have no way of validating whether or not they really are there, and yet we believe them. We trust them. We rely upon the scientific evidence put before us by others because we assume the other minds are really real. We don't scientifically validate them. And fifthly, valid senses. And I don't mean that our eyes can't play tricks on ourselves, or noses, or any of those things, or ears. But what I mean by that is the very assumption that your nose, your eyes, your ears are bringing true data to you from the outside world is something you must believe. You cannot prove or falsify it. It must be true because any attempt to gather data that way assumes that they are in fact working. So what I want to challenge us with today is the big question. Which worldview makes sense of these assumptions? Can atheism validate all of those 5 assumptions, or is Christianity the one that makes sense of these? And over the next 5 weeks, I want to give us 5 proofs of the existence of God, and those 5 proofs are this. Number 1, the impossibility of the contrary. We'll look at that today. Number 2, the first cause argument. Number 3, the design argument. Number 4, the argument from necessity. And number 5, the moral argument. And don't be intimidated if you don't get or understand all these. In fact, if you have questions, please submit them to Mrs. Susan, and I would love to answer them as I can. You don't have to know all these. I just want to show you that there is a rational foundation for belief in God. And so let's start with number 1. Proof number 1 is this. It's called the impossibility of the contrary. And for the more technical term, it's called a transcendental argument. But what I really want you to remember is it's impossible for the contrary to be true. That is, the universe and all that we know about truth in the world cannot exist if God does not exist. That's what I mean by the impossibility of the contrary. That is, we know that God exists because without God it is impossible to prove anything at all. Now, I do not mean that anyone listening to this who is a skeptic is going to immediately agree with me on that. Nevertheless, it is the case that all assumptions and truth claims are totally arbitrary if God does not exist. So I've got a few memes here that I've made in the past. Look at the one on the left of the power strip. And if you claim only to believe in science, that is, you're a skeptic and you only believe in what you can see, feel, taste, touch, or whatever, you're virtually doing the same thing as this power cord is. You're plugging into yourself. That is, you're being circular because you actually haven't proven that your sense perception or any of those things are reliable. So to only believe in science is to leave yourself ungrounded. You have no grounding for truth. And just to show you, I made this Velociraptor meme, and it goes something like this. If science must presuppose, that's just a fancy word for saying assume things like logic, not every rational belief can be scientific. And I just want us to get that no one can use science without things believed outside of science, as I've already said. And so thirdly, we've got Bad Luck Brian over here, who only believes in what he can prove, but he can't even prove the reliability of the senses, which is what I hope to show you in just a minute. So proof number 1 is this. If God does not exist, then nothing can be proven at all. And I want to show you what I mean by that. Now, I've got this title at the top here. Asking for proof requires truth, right? In other words, you have to assume truth exists before you can even talk about proof. Now, let me give you an illustration because I know this can get kind of heady and just feels kind of hard to understand. So here's an example. If you look at this apple orchard, let's say you inherited this apple orchard and you had the opportunity to collect all these apples and go and sell them in a market. Well, let's say you do that. You gather them all into these boxes, you go to the market, and you begin to sell them. What you'll find very quickly is people will stop buying your apples because you've failed to separate the good apples from the bad apples. So you go back home and you think, okay, if this apple orchard is going to work, I need a system for devising. I need a system for dividing between good and bad apples. But you cannot make a system for separating good and bad apples unless you first have criteria for what is a good or a bad apple, right? To build the system to separate good and bad apples, you must first have criteria about what is a good or bad apple. And the same goes for the pursuit of truth about reality. If you don't first assume a system for separating true and false conclusions about reality, you cannot begin to even test it. So all that to say, if God does not exist, you have no basis for true and false conclusions. If we look at anyone who makes a truth claim and they don't ground it in God, you can simply begin to ask the question, well, how do you know that's true? And how do you know that's true? And on and on and on you can go until at the very foundation what you'll see is they must arbitrarily assume things to be true that have not been proven. Because if God does not exist, there is no basis for true and false conclusions about reality. God is the truth. and he is the point of reference from which all knowledge begins. Now, I'm not saying you can't be intelligent if you don't believe in God. What I'm saying is that it doesn't make sense to make any truth claims unless we understand that God exists. Now, a really good video on YouTube to show you one of the problems with naturalism is right here at the bottom. It's titled Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. This is put together by a man named Alvin Plantinga, and what he shows you very briefly through a 8-minute video cartoon is that what evolutionary theory argues is that our senses have been wired to keep us alive. But in order for our senses to keep us alive, they don't actually have to bring us the truth. In other words, sometimes you'll hear people say, "Oh, well, religion was just a defense mechanism of our minds to keep us from, say, going into that bush over there, right? Let's say there's danger over in that bush. Well, evolutionary processes convinced us that God is over in that bush, so we shouldn't go near it, and it drives us away. So it successfully keeps us alive, even though it hasn't done so by the truth. And if evolution is true and God does not exist, we lose all grounds for believing that our senses are trying to bring us the truth. All we know is that they're trying to keep us alive, but you cannot scientifically prove that they are really giving you valid truth." And again, it's a great argument from a well-respected philosopher that without God, you have no basis for true and false conclusions. So just as this apple orchard needs a criteria for good and bad apples, so we must start with a criteria for true and false conclusions. And the Christian argument is that this start is God. And so I just want to close with these two verses. That if we are going to believe in an intelligent universe, that is a universe in which we can know things, well, we must have a starting point of intelligence. And as Proverbs 1 verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." In other words, what we believe is that knowledge is good, wisdom is good, instruction is good. But the only real way to know and understand the universe is to understand it in reference to God. That's the only way to have a real and comprehensive understanding of the details of reality. I'm not saying you can't know a lot of facts. It's kind of like the statement, knowledge is knowing that tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. That's the idea here. Knowledge is not just about facts. It's about understanding and interpreting them in reference to the whole. And what we're saying, what this scripture is saying, is that without God, you can't do that. You can't understand it. And that's what's so amazing, though, because we understand that wisdom is not this category outside. It's a person, as John 1 verse 1 tells us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Greek here is this word logos, where we get our word logic from. And what John is saying is that Jesus is the wisdom of God made manifest. Jesus is the embodied intelligence of the universe, such that if you truly want to know wisdom and you truly want to understand reality, then you must come to the divine wisdom. See, the Greeks understood that the universe operated according to some sort of wisdom, but it was the Jews in the early church who specifically knew that it operated according to a certain wisdom, because wisdom is a person, and you have been made in that person's image. So, may you know that the first proof of God's existence is the impossibility of the contrary. If you want to know and understand the universe, you must come to Christ, the beginning and source of all wisdom. So that's number one. We'll do a few more in the weeks to come. Thanks for joining.